He thought it was just a piece of wood in the snow, but he discovered a $1 million secret. Arthur Miller was determined to find out what had caught his attention in the backyard, despite the intense blizzard punishing the small town of Aspen that January morning. At 68, his stubbornness was known throughout the neighborhood, and not even the desperate pleas of his wife could make him give up. The dark shape standing out among the white flakes had intrigued him since he woke up. Margaret, his companion of 42 years of marriage, watched from the kitchen window as he bundled up in the old grey coat he had worn for decades as a mason. "Arthur, for heaven's sake, leave that thing alone. It's snowing like crazy out there," shouted Margaret, adjusting the colourful shawl over her shoulders. Her hands trembled, not just from the cold seeping through the door crack, but from worry for her stubborn husband. "Woman, it's just a quick look. It might be a branch that broke off the cherry tree and will ruin your flower bed," he replied, already putting on his worn rubber boots. What bothered Arthur most wasn't just curiosity. It was something deeper, a strange premonition he couldn't explain. Throughout his life, he had trusted the intuition that had guided him since the difficult times of his childhood, when he lost his parents as a boy and was raised by his maternal grandmother. Margaret sighed heavily, recognizing that determined expression on her husband's face. It was the same stubbornness that had made him build the small house they lived in with his own hands, brick by brick, even when everyone said he couldn't do it. The same obstinacy that had driven him to work double shifts to put their 3 children through school, all of them now graduated and well established in life. "If you're going out in this awful cold, at least take the hat," she said, handing him the grey wool cap she had knitted last winter. Arthur kissed his wife's forehead, a tender gesture they maintained even after so many years together. Margaret had always been the voice of reason in his life, the person who calmed him when his impulsive nature threatened to cause trouble. But this time, something inside him insisted he needed to investigate that protrusion in the snow. The biting cold hit his face as soon as he opened the door. The snowflakes fell thick and heavy, accumulating quickly over everything. The small but well-kept backyard was unrecognizable under the white blanket. The rose bushes Margaret cultivated with such care were just white mounds, and the herb garden seemed to have disappeared completely. Arthur trudged with difficulty through the snow that already reached his ankles. Each step sank and required extra effort to keep his balance. His breath formed small clouds in the icy air, and soon his fingers began to tingle even inside the worn leather gloves. The dark shape was about 5 meters from the back door, near the spot where they used to have cookouts on summer Sundays. As he approached, he realized it wasn't a broken branch as he had imagined. It seemed to be something buried a long time ago, with only a small part exposed by the wind that had swept the snow from that specific area. Arthur knelt in the cold snow, feeling the dampness seep through his thick pants. With his gloved hands, he began to carefully dig around the object. The snow was compact and heavy, sticking to his gloves and making the work difficult, but his determination only grew as he realized there was something solid and defined under the white layer. Margaret appeared at the door holding a steaming cup of coffee. "Arthur Miller, you're going to catch pneumonia out there. Come have a hot coffee and leave this nonsense after it stops snowing." "Margaret, come here and see this," he replied without stopping digging. "It's not wood, no. It's something different." Reluctantly, Margaret put on her boots and approached her husband, carefully stepping on the slippery snow. When she got close enough to see what he was digging up, her expression changed from irritation to genuine curiosity. "Good heavens, what a strange thing," she murmured, watching the rusty metal surface beginning to appear under the snow. It was a small box, about the size of a shoebox, but made of metal that had taken on a greenish tint from the passage of time. Rust covered almost the entire surface, creating irregular patterns that told the story of the years buried in that spot. On one side, it was possible to make out what looked like an old lock, also taken over by corrosion. "How long do you think this thing has been down here?" asked Margaret, her voice laden with a mix of fascination and apprehension. Arthur continued digging around the box, trying to free it completely from the compacted earth that held it. The work was arduous, and soon his back began to complain about the uncomfortable position. But the discovery had awakened an energy he hadn't felt in years. "By the amount of rust, I'd say decades, Margaret." Decades indeed. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. When he finally managed to loosen the box from the earth, Arthur was surprised by its weight. It was heavier than he expected for its size, indicating there was something substantial inside. The surface was rough to the touch, and small pieces of rust flaked off as he handled it. "Be careful, Arthur. There might be something dangerous in there," warned Margaret. But her own curiosity was evident in how she leaned in to examine the box more closely. "Don't be silly, woman. If it's been buried for so long, what danger could it have?" Back in the house with wet clothes and bodies trembling from the cold, the couple warmed themselves by the small electric heater in the living room. The mysterious box rested on the kitchen table, dripping melted water from the snow that had accumulated in its crevices. Margaret made more coffee, while Arthur carefully examined the object under the lamplight. The dimensions were approximately 10 inches long by 6 inches wide and 4 inches high. The material seemed to be some kind of metal alloy, possibly iron or steel, which had held up relatively well against the passage of time despite the surface rust. "Look here, Margaret," he said, pointing to a small, almost imperceptible engraving on one side. "There's something written, but I can't see it clearly." Margaret approached, adjusting her reading glasses. With a magnifying glass she used for embroidery, she managed to make out some letters. It seems to say, "Wait a minute, M-U-S-I-C, music." It's a music box, Arthur. The revelation added an even greater layer of mystery to the discovery. Music boxes weren't common objects in that rural region, especially decades ago when life was simpler and luxuries were rare. Who would have buried a music box in their backyard, and why? Arthur tried to open the lid, but the rust had effectively welded the lock shut. Each attempt to force it open resulted only in small pieces of corroded metal flaking off, with no real progress. Frustration began to grow in his chest, fueled by a curiosity that seemed to increase with every passing minute. "Let's try a little machine oil," suggested Margaret, ever practical. "If the rust loosens, maybe we can open it." Arthur carefully applied the oil to the lock and visible hinges, hoping the liquid would penetrate the layers of corrosion. As they waited, they talked about the possibilities of how that box had ended up there. "Do you think it was here when we bought the house?" asked Margaret. "Impossible. Remember, I dug up the entire backyard when I planted the cherry tree. If anything had been buried, I would have found it then." The house they had lived in for 25 years had been bought from an elderly man named Edward Harrison, who had moved to live with his daughter in Washington after his wife passed away. Edward had always been a reserved man, but he had never given any indication of keeping secrets or having eccentric habits that would explain a buried music box. "Maybe Edward buried it after he sold it to us," suggested Margaret. "Remember, he came back a few times in the first year, saying he wanted to see how the house was doing." Arthur remembered Edward's visits. The former owner would show up from time to time, always with some excuse to walk around the backyard. He would say he wanted to see if the trees he had planted were doing well, or that he had come to fetch some tool he had forgotten in the shed. At the time, it had seemed normal. After all, it was understandable that someone would feel nostalgic for a house they had lived in for decades. But now, with the mysterious box before them, those visits took on a different meaning. Could Edward have come to hide something, or perhaps to retrieve something that was already there? After an hour of applying oil and careful attempts, the lock finally gave way with a dull click. The lid opened slowly, revealing an interior that was surprisingly well preserved. A layer of yellowed cotton lined the bottom, protecting the objects resting on it. Margaret held her breath as Arthur delicately removed the first item, an envelope made of thick paper, yellowed with age, but still intact. Beneath the envelope there was a small golden key, and what appeared to be the mechanism of a music box, its delicate gears still shining faintly despite the years. "My heart is racing," murmured Margaret, sitting in the chair beside her husband. Arthur opened the envelope with extreme care, fearing the paper would crumble in his hands. Inside were 3 folded documents and a black and white photograph, slightly faded, but still clear enough to distinguish faces and details. The photograph showed 2 men standing in front of a rural property. One of them, younger, had features that Arthur recognized immediately. They were his own features, or rather, the family traits he had inherited from his paternal grandfather. The other man, older and dressed in more expensive clothes, held some papers in his hand and smiled at the camera. "Arthur, this younger man," Margaret pointed to the photograph. "It's my grandfather. I'm absolutely certain. My father used to show me pictures of him when I was a boy." Edward Miller, Arthur's grandfather, had been an enigmatic figure in the family history. According to the few stories that had reached him, Edward had been a hard-working man who owned some land in the region, but had sold it abruptly and disappeared from town when Arthur's father was still a child. The family had always believed he had left in search of better opportunities somewhere far away, abandoning the family for ambition or adventure. The first document was a property deed dated 1952 in the name of Edward Miller. The area described was significant, 23 hectares of land in what is now the expanded downtown area of Aspen. Arthur knew that area well. It was where the city's main commercial center now operated, with supermarkets, stores, and even a small fruit processing plant. "Margaret, look at the size of this property," he said, pointing to the numbers on the document. 23 hectares right in the center of town. The second document was even more intriguing, a partnership agreement between Edward Miller and Alfred Harrison, dated just 1 month after the deed. The document established that Alfred would manage the lands while Edward would handle other business opportunities with an equal division of profits. Harrison. "Margaret, could this Alfred Harrison be related to the Edward Harrison who sold us the house?" Margaret held the document closer to the light, examining the signature. The handwriting was clear and elaborate, the kind taught in old schools. In the lower right corner there was an official seal she couldn't fully identify due to the paper's deterioration. It could be his father or grandfather. The Harrisons have always been a traditional family here in the region. The third document was what shocked them the most. It was a power of attorney, also dated 1952, granting full powers to Alfred Harrison to represent Edward Miller in all matters related to the properties. What caught their attention was a handwritten note in the margin. "Temporary, until my return from Washington, E.M." "Arthur, your grandfather never sold the lands," said Margaret, her voice almost a whisper. "He only gave a temporary power of attorney." The revelation hit Arthur like a punch to the stomach. His entire life he had heard stories about how his grandfather abandoned the family, selling everything for easy money and disappearing without a trace. The shame of that abandonment had deeply marked his father, who grew up believing he had been rejected by his own parent. It means someone lied to your family all these years. The golden key that came with the documents had a small inscription engraved on it. Vault B47, Regional Trust Bank. Arthur turned the key between his fingers, feeling the weight of the metal which, unlike the rest of the box, showed no signs of corrosion. Margaret stood up and began pacing the kitchen, a habit she had developed when she was nervous or thinking intensely. Her practical mind was already processing the implications of the discovery. If this power of attorney was temporary, and your grandfather never sold the lands, then that whole area should still belong to our family, Arthur completed, his voice laden with conflicting emotions. The possibility was both exciting and terrifying. If the lands had indeed never been legally sold, the current value of the property would be astronomical. The shopping mall operating on the site generated millions of dollars annually, and the real estate value of the area had multiplied dozens of times in recent decades. But it also meant that for 70 years, someone had illegally benefited from properties that didn't belong to them. And that person or their descendants certainly wouldn't hand everything back without a fight. Arthur picked up the photograph again, examining the face of the older man who appeared next to his grandfather. There was something familiar about those features, a resemblance he couldn't fully identify, but that bothered his memory. "Margaret, bring me that box of old photos from the bedroom." While Margaret fetched the family photographs, Arthur continued analyzing the documents. His grandfather's handwritten script was clear and firm, indicating a literate and careful person, very different from the image of an impulsive man who would abandon his family for ambition. When Margaret returned with the box of photographs, they began searching for old family pictures. Among faded photos of weddings, baptisms, and family gatherings, They found some of Grandfather Edward that definitively confirmed the identity of the man in the music box photograph. "Look at this one," said Margaret, showing a photo where Edward appeared next to a woman and a small child. "This must be your grandmother and your father as a boy." The resemblance between Arthur and his grandfather was striking. The same expressive eyes, the same jawline, even the way they held their shoulders was similar. It was like looking at a younger version of himself. "You know what bothers me?" said Arthur after a long silence. "Why would my grandfather bury these things here? This house didn't even exist back then." Margaret stopped handling the photographs and looked at her husband with a thoughtful expression. "Arthur, do you remember what Edward Harrison told us about the history of this house?" "Vaguely. He said his father built it in the 50s when this area was still somewhat rural." "Exactly. And what if Edward Harrison's father was the same Alfred Harrison from the documents?" The possibility made Arthur's blood run cold. If Margaret was right, it meant that Edward Harrison, the man who sold them the house, was the son of the man who had possibly swindled his grandfather. And worse, it meant that Edward's frequent visits after the sale of the house weren't motivated by nostalgia, but by the need to recover incriminating evidence. But then why didn't he take the box when he had the chance? Maybe he didn't know exactly where it was buried. Or perhaps your grandfather was smarter than we think. Margaret's theory made sense in a disturbing way. If Edward Miller had suspected Alfred Harrison's intentions, he could have hidden the evidence in a safe place before leaving for Washington. And choosing to bury the box on the land he knew would eventually be built on by Alfred himself would be a brilliant way to ensure the evidence remained close but inaccessible. "Margaret, we need to find out if the Regional Trust Bank still exists. And if it does, what are we going to do with this key?" The question echoed in the kitchen like a challenge. They were simple people, used to a modest and uncomplicated life. The possibility of being involved in a complex legal matter, potentially involving a fortune, was intimidating. But at the same time, there was something deeply unfair about the situation. If Arthur's grandfather really had been swindled, his memory deserved to be cleared. And if the family had legal rights to those properties, it would be cowardly not to investigate. "First, let's find out more about this story," decided Arthur. "Then we'll think about what to do." Margaret agreed, but her expression revealed concern. She knew her husband well. She knew that when Arthur decided on something, he rarely changed his mind. And she sensed that this discovery would change their lives in an irreversible way. The music box mechanism still worked partially. When Arthur turned the small key on the side, a melancholy melody began to play, occasionally interrupted by gears stuck with rust. The music was old, probably from some popular waltz in the 40s or 50s. "What a beautiful melody," murmured Margaret. "I bet your grandmother loved this music." The observation brought a wave of emotion that Arthur hadn't expected. All his life, he had only heard fragmented stories about his paternal grandparents. His grandmother had passed away when he was very young, and his grandfather had disappeared soon after, leaving a void in the family history that had never been completely filled. Now, holding that music box and hearing the melody that had possibly played in his family home decades ago, he felt an emotional connection to ancestors he had barely known. It was as if a door to the past had opened, revealing not only secrets, but also the opportunity to better understand his own origins. "Let's put all of this away very safely," he said, carefully gathering the documents and the photograph. "And tomorrow, when it stops snowing, we'll start investigating." Margaret prepared a shoebox lined with soft fabric to accommodate the documents and the key. The music box was carefully cleaned and placed on the living room sideboard, where its intermittent melody created a nostalgic atmosphere that seemed to transport them to another time. That night, neither of them could sleep properly. Arthur lay awake thinking about the grandfather he had never really known, imagining how he must have felt upon realizing he was being deceived. Margaret, for her part, worried about the complications this discovery could bring to their quiet lives. The next morning, the blizzard had ceased, leaving Aspen covered by a white blanket that transformed the familiar landscape into something magical and unrecognizable. The sun shone in a crystal blue sky, making the snow glisten like thousands of diamonds scattered everywhere. Arthur woke with renewed determination. During the early hours he had made a decision. Regardless of the consequences, he would uncover the truth about what had happened to his grandfather. He owed it not only to the memory of Edward Miller, but also to his own father, who had died believing he had been abandoned. "Margaret, let's go downtown today," he announced as they had breakfast. "I want to see this shopping center with my own eyes." "Arthur, are you sure you want to stir this up? We're fine the way we are. Why complicate things?" Margaret's question was reasonable, but Arthur felt he had no choice. The discovery of the music box hadn't been accidental. It was as if his grandfather himself was asking for the truth to finally come to light. "I can't pretend I didn't find these things, Margaret. I just can't." The shopping center was about 15 kilometers from their neighborhood, in an area Arthur knew well from having worked in construction throughout that region during his career. When they arrived, they were impressed by the size and activity of the complex. The Aspen Plaza Mall was a large modern development with 3 main buildings connected by covered walkways. There was a large supermarket, several clothing and appliance stores, a food court, and even a bank branch. The parking lot was full even on a Tuesday morning. "Wow, Arthur," said Margaret, watching the bustle. "If all this area belonged to your grandfather—" Arthur didn't answer immediately, but his eyes were instinctively calculating. 23 acres in the commercial heart of Aspen were worth a fortune he didn't even know how to estimate. The monthly rent from all those stores alone should be enough to comfortably support an entire family. They decided to go inside the mall and walk around a bit, trying not to look too obvious in their investigation. In the food court, they sat down to have a coffee and observe the activity. It was impressive how many people circulated through the place, shopping, working, living their normal lives on land that possibly belonged to Arthur's family. "Excuse me," Arthur said to the waiter who brought their coffees. "Do you know how long this mall has been open?" "Oh, it's been about 15 years since it opened, Mr. Arthur. But the Harrison family had businesses here long before that. My father says old Alfred Harrison started with a small shop in the 60s. The name Alfred Harrison made Arthur and Margaret exchange a significant look. It couldn't be a coincidence. "Alfred Harrison, is he still alive?" "No, sir. He passed away a long time ago, but his son, Mr. Edward Harrison, still runs the family business. In fact, he should be around here today. He always stops by on Tuesdays to check on things." Arthur nearly choked on his coffee. Edward Harrison, the man who had sold them the house, was not only the son of Alfred Harrison, but was still involved with the businesses on the land that had possibly been stolen from his family. Is it possible to speak with him?" The waiter, a friendly young man in his early 20s, smiled. "Of course. He's very approachable. Let me see if he's in the office." As the waiter walked away, Margaret held her husband's hand. "Arthur, are you sure you want to do this now? Wouldn't it be better to find a lawyer first?" "Margaret, if I don't do this now, I'll never have the courage again." Minutes later, the waiter returned accompanied by a man Arthur recognized immediately. Edward Harrison had aged in the 25 years since he sold them the house, but he still maintained the upright posture and penetrating gaze that defined him. "Mr. Arthur, what a pleasant surprise," said Edward, extending his hand with a smile that seemed genuine. "How is Mrs. Margaret?" "We're well, Mr. Edward. It's good to see you." Edward Harrison must have been about 75, but he appeared vital and was clearly still active in business. He wore expensive but discreet clothes, and his presence commanded natural respect. When he sat down at the table with them, Arthur noticed his eyes were the same as the man's in the old photograph. He was definitely the son of Alfred Harrison. "So, how is the little house? I hope you're taking good care of it." "The house is great, Mr. Edward. Actually, I wanted to speak with you about something we found in the backyard." Edward's expression changed subtly. The smile remained, but his eyes became more attentive, more calculating. "Oh, really? Found something?" Arthur took a deep breath. It was now or never. "A buried box, with some old papers inside." The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity. Edward Harrison became completely still, only his eyes moving between Arthur and Margaret. When he finally spoke, his voice had completely lost its previous friendliness. What kind of papers? Property documents. From my grandfather, Edward Miller. If Arthur expected a reaction of surprise, he was disappointed. Edward Harrison simply nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had known for a long time. "I see," he said, his voice now cold and controlled. "And what do you intend to do with these documents?" "First, I wanted to understand what happened. Was my grandfather a partner with your father?" Edward stood up abruptly, his previous friendliness completely evaporated. "Listen here, you two. I don't know what story you've invented, but my father bought that land legally 70 years ago. Everything was registered, everything was paid for. If you come here making accusations, I'll have to call my lawyers." The drastic change in Edward's behavior confirmed all of Arthur's suspicions. An innocent man would have reacted with curiosity or confusion, not with immediate threats. "No one is making accusations, Mr. Edward. I just want to understand." "There's nothing to understand. And if I were you, I'd forget this whole story. Some things are better left in the past." With those words, Edward Harrison quickly walked away, leaving Arthur and Margaret alone in the food court. The waiter, who had witnessed part of the conversation, seemed uncomfortable and soon found an excuse to leave as well. "Arthur, he got scared," whispered Margaret. "Did you see how he changed when you mentioned the documents?" "I did, and that tells me we're on the right track." Edward's reaction had confirmed there really was something to hide. An innocent man wouldn't react with such hostility to questions about events from 70 years ago. His sudden change in behavior and the veiled threats indicated he knew exactly what Arthur was talking about. On the way back home, the couple talked about the next steps. The confirmation that Edward Harrison was the son of Alfred Harrison and his defensive reaction had turned suspicions into near certainties. But suspicions weren't legal evidence, and they would need much more than old documents to challenge properties established decades ago. "We need to look for this regional trust bank," said Margaret. "If it still exists, maybe the key opens something important. And if it doesn't exist anymore, then we go after who bought the archives. A bank doesn't just vanish. There's always someone who assumes the responsibilities." Back home, Arthur spent the rest of the afternoon on the internet, researching information about the regional trust bank. He discovered the institution had operated in Aspen between 1948 and 1987, when it was incorporated by a larger bank. The archives had been transferred to the State Heritage Bank branch that operated downtown. "Tomorrow we go to the bank," he decided. "Let's see what's in that safe deposit box, B47. Margaret spent the night sewing, a habit that calmed her when she was anxious. But her thoughts were far from the stitches she was making. The hostile reaction from Edward Harrison had scared her more than she admitted to her husband. Men with power and money could be dangerous when they felt threatened. "Arthur, do you think we're running any risk?" "How so?" "Edward Harrison has a lot of money, a lot of influence in the city. If he really is hiding something—" Arthur stopped reading the papers he had been studying for the 100th time that day and looked at his wife. Her concern was legitimate. They were simple people, without the resources to face a legal battle against someone powerful. "Margaret, if we do nothing, this doubt will always remain. I need to know the truth about my grandfather. And if the truth is dangerous?" The question hung in the air unanswered. Both knew they had crossed an invisible line. The discovery of the music box had set them on a path they might not be able to abandon, even if they wanted to. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out, now continuing. The next morning, they went to the State Heritage Bank in downtown Aspen. It was an old but well-maintained branch with employees who knew many customers by name. Arthur explained the situation to the manager, a middle-aged man named Stephen Taylor. "A key from the old regional trust bank?" said Stephen, examining the small golden key. "That's very rare. Most safe deposit boxes were opened when we made the transition, but some remained unclaimed because the owners had died or disappeared." "And do they still exist?" "Some, yes, we keep them for legal reasons. But to open one, you would need documentation proving you are the legal heir." Arthur showed the documents found in the music box, explaining the family situation. Stephen examined everything carefully, comparing signatures and dates. "It's a complex situation," the manager admitted. "I'll consult our legal department. If everything is in order, we can try to locate safe deposit box B47. The wait was agonizing. Stephen disappeared for almost an hour, leaving Arthur and Margaret alone in the meeting room. When he returned, he wore a serious expression that didn't promise good news. "We found the box, and the key does indeed fit, but there's a problem." "What kind of problem?" "We have received court orders not to open any safe deposit boxes related to the Harrison or Miller families without specific authorization from the court." Arthur felt his blood run cold. Edward Harrison had anticipated them, using his influence to block any attempt to access evidence that could compromise him. When were these orders issued? Yesterday afternoon. The speed of the reaction definitively confirmed that Edward Harrison had something to hide. No innocent man would take such drastic and swift legal measures just 24 hours after a casual conversation. And now? What can we do? Stephen seemed genuinely troubled by the situation. You would need a lawyer to challenge the court orders, and that could take months, maybe years. They left the bank frustrated and discouraged. Edward Harrison had used his power and influence to create legal obstacles that would be difficult to overcome. But ironically, his desperate actions only confirmed there was something valuable to hide. "Margaret, he wouldn't do all this if he weren't afraid," said Arthur, as they walked through the town's central square. "But how do we prove anything if he has a judge in his pocket?" It was a disturbing question. In small towns, influential families like the Harrisons often had connections that stretched for generations through all spheres of local power. They decided to seek help at the law office of Dr. Scott Fletcher, a respected professional who served middle-class people in town. Scott was known for his honesty and for not being easily intimidated, qualities that would be essential in that situation. The office was simple but organized, reflecting the practical personality of its owner. Scott Fletcher was around 50, with graying hair and the air of someone who had seen many legal battles throughout his career. "Regional Trust Bank documents?" he said, examining the papers with growing interest. "This is fascinating. If these documents are authentic, you might have a very strong case." "Doctor, do you think they're real?" "At first glance, yes. The paper, the ink, the official seals, everything seems consistent with the period, but we would need an expert analysis to be sure." Scott explained that property cases involving old documents were complex, especially when there was a possibility of fraud or forgery from decades ago. The process would be long, expensive, and with no guarantee of success. "But before anything," he said, "we need to access what's in that safe. These court orders can be challenged." "How long would it take?" "With luck, a few weeks. Without luck, a few months." Arthur and Margaret exchanged discouraged looks. They didn't have the financial resources for a prolonged legal battle, and Edward Harrison would certainly use every means at his disposal to protect his interests. "Dr. Scott, may I ask a personal question?" said Margaret. "Of course. Aren't you afraid of getting involved with the Harrisons? They have a lot of power in this town." Scott smiled, but it was a weary smile from someone who had faced similar situations before. "Mrs. Margaret, if I were afraid of powerful people, I wouldn't have been a lawyer for 25 years, and I can assure you that cases like this, involving possible historical fraud, interest me much more than health plan contracts." The statement brought a spark of hope to the couple. Finally, they had found someone willing to stand up to the Harrisons, even knowing the risks involved. "Here's what we'll do," Scott continued. "I'll challenge these court orders free of charge. If we manage to open the safe and find solid evidence, then we discuss fees. If it leads nowhere, at least we tried." The offer was more than Arthur and Margaret dared to hope for. For the first time since discovering the music box, they felt they weren't alone in that fight. Scott prepared the necessary documents to challenge the court orders that same day. His strategy was to argue that the orders had been issued without a solid legal basis, constituting an abuse of judicial power. "One thing intrigues me," he said while drafting the challenge. "Why did your grandfather choose to bury that evidence specifically in that location?" Arthur had asked himself the same question many times. Maybe he knew the house would be built there and wanted the evidence to be close by but protected. "Or perhaps," suggested Margaret, He knew someone would come looking for them and wanted them to be in a place only the family could find. Margaret's theory made sense. If Edward Miller had truly suspected Alfred Harrison's intentions, he could have hidden the evidence so that only his descendants could find it when the right time came. "Regardless of the motivations," said Scott, "the important thing is that they were found. And now we're going to discover what else he hid in that safe deposit box." 2 weeks later, Scott obtained a partial court order. The judge ruled that the blocking orders were excessively broad and granted permission for the specific opening of safe deposit box B47, provided it was done in the presence of a court officer. The date was set for a Tuesday morning. Arthur could barely sleep the night before, imagining what they might find. Margaret, ever practical, packed a bag with documents, a camera borrowed from a neighbor, and even a small snack, anticipating the process could be lengthy. At the bank, they were greeted by Stephen Taylor, Dr. Scott, and a court officer named Gregory Brooks. The atmosphere was tense but formal, with everyone aware of the historical and legal importance of the moment. Safe deposit box B47 was located in the oldest section of the bank's vaults. It was a medium-sized metal box with a dual lock that required both Arthur's key and a master key from the bank to open. When the door swung open, it revealed contents that exceeded all expectations. There were more documents, carefully organized in leather folders, a small pouch of gold coins, and something even more valuable, detailed photographs of meetings between Edward Miller and Alfred Harrison. The first document was a handwritten letter addressed to my descendants. The handwriting was the same as that on the documents found in the music box, confirming the authenticity of everything they had discovered. If you are reading this, it is because you have finally discovered the truth about what happened to me and to our lands. Alfred Harrison deceived me, using my trust and my need to travel to Washington for a few months to attend to urgent business. When I returned, I discovered he had registered the lands in his own name, claiming I had sold them to him. The letter continued for several pages, describing in detail how Alfred had falsified sale documents, bribed public officials, and even threatened witnesses who could confirm the true version of events. I tried to fight legally, but Alfred had more money and more influence. The lawyers I sought were bought off or intimidated. I realized I wouldn't be able to recover my lands at that time, but I also understood that one day the truth would need to come to light. The most impressive items were the photographs. Edward Miller had managed to document several secret meetings between Alfred Harrison and public officials, including images that clearly showed the handing over of envelopes that obviously contained bribes. "My God," murmured the court officer, "your grandfather assembled a veritable criminal dossier." There were also copies of the original, authentic documents from before the forgeries, and even letters in which Alfred Harrison admitted in writing that the lands still belonged to Edward Miller, but that he would handle the business until everything was settled. "This is enough evidence to dismantle any defense," said Dr. Scott, carefully photographing each document. "With this proof, there's no way to deny fraud occurred. The pouch of gold coins contained 20 pieces, each dated before 1952. It was the money Edward had saved to invest in the property, but had never been able to use due to his partner's betrayal. Edward's letter ended with an emotional message. "I know I will not return to Aspen. The struggle has worn me out, and I fear what Alfred may do to our family if I persist. But you, my descendants, deserve to know the truth. And when the time comes, you deserve to reclaim what is rightfully yours. Forgive me for not being strong enough to fight to the end. I hope you will be braver than I was." Arthur discreetly wiped his eyes. All his life he had carried the shame of a grandfather who had abandoned the family. Now he discovered that Edward Miller had been a victim, not a villain, and that his departure had been motivated by fear and disillusionment, not greed. "Arthur," said Margaret, holding his hand, "your grandfather did not abandon you, he was driven out." The emotional impact of the discovery was enormous, but the legal impact would be even greater. With that evidence, they had not only a strong case to recover the properties, but also to sue the Harrison family for decades of illicit enrichment. Dr. Scott was already planning the legal strategy. "We'll file a lawsuit to annul the deed due to flawed consent, seeking both moral and material damages. With this evidence, it's practically impossible to lose. And how much could all this be worth? Asked Margaret, ever practical. Conservatively? Between $15 and $20 million, just considering the current value of the properties. If we include the profits the Harrison family obtained illegally over 70 years, it could exceed $50 million. The numbers were astronomical for a couple used to living on a modest retirement. Arthur felt a dizziness he couldn't tell was from emotion or fear. When they left the bank, there was already a small group of curious people waiting on the sidewalk. News travels fast in small towns, and the unusual activity at the bank had sparked interest. "Mr. Arthur," shouted an elderly lady he knew from the market, "is it true you found a treasure?" The innocent question made Arthur realize his private life was over. Within hours, the whole town would know he was challenging the Harrisons' ownership, and Edward Harrison would certainly take even more drastic measures to protect his interests. "Margaret, our life is going to change completely," he said as they walked home. "For better or worse? I don't know that yet." That afternoon, Dr. Scott called with worrying news. "Arthur, I need you both to stay home for the next few days. Edward Harrison has hired a law firm from Denver, specializing in tough cases. They're going to try to invalidate everything we found. Can they succeed? They'll try. And I've also heard they're investigating your lives, looking for something they can use to discredit the case." The news was a cold shower. Arthur had imagined that with the evidence found, the case would be straightforward. Now he realized Edward Harrison would not easily give up a fortune built on a 70-year fraud. "Doctor, can they harm us in some way?" "Legally, no. But powerful men have other resources. Be careful." Margaret began checking that the doors and windows were securely locked before bed. Arthur, for his part, started noticing unfamiliar cars driving slowly down their street. Was the paranoia justified or just a reflection of the stress? 3 days later, they got their answer. Dr. Scott arrived at their house with a grave expression that promised no good news. They filed a motion questioning the authenticity of the documents. They claim everything was forged recently to extort the Harrison family. "But that's ridiculous," protested Margaret. "The papers were buried for decades. I know, you know, but they're going to try to prove otherwise. And they've hired very expensive experts to analyze the documents." The strategy was clever. Even if they couldn't prove forgery, they would create enough doubt to drag out the process for years. And time was something Arthur and Margaret, already in their later years, did not have in abundance. How long could it take? At least 2 years, possibly 5 or more. The prospect of a legal battle that could last the rest of their lives was disheartening. But giving up would mean allowing the injustice against their grandfather to stand forever. "Dr. Scott, is there anything we can do to speed up the process?" "There is a possibility. If we could get more evidence, witnesses, or documents proving the papers were buried decades ago, it would be harder for them to dispute." Arthur thought of the visits Edward Harrison had made to the house after selling them the property. If he was really looking for the buried box, other people might have noticed his strange behavior. "I'll talk to the old neighbors. Maybe someone remembers something." The search for witnesses revealed interesting information. Mrs. Dorothy, an 80-year-old lady who had lived in the house next door for 50 years, remembered Edward Harrison's visits perfectly. "He came here all the time, always with a different excuse," she said, serving coffee in her modest but tidy living room. "But what I found strange was that he was always poking around in your backyard, as if he was looking for something lost. Do you remember when those visits were?" "Oh, it was right after you bought the house. He'd show up once a month, sometimes even more. And always alone, he never brought his wife." Mrs. Dorothy also remembered seeing Edward using a small shovel and searching different areas of the yard. At the time, she thought he was looking for a forgotten tool or personal item. "Once I even asked if he wanted help, but he got very nervous and said he didn't need anything," she continued. "After that, whenever he saw me, he'd always make an excuse to leave quickly." Mrs. Dorothy's testimony was officially recorded by Dr. Scott, creating additional evidence that Edward Harrison knew of the existence of something buried on the property and had tried unsuccessfully to retrieve it. Other neighbors confirmed the suspicious visits, and some remembered specific details that strengthened the case. Mr. George, who had worked as a gardener for several families in the area, remembered Edward asking about the best places to hide valuables during house construction. He said it was just curiosity, but he insisted a lot on the subject, George said. He wanted to know if it was better to bury things near trees or away from them, if rainwater could damage buried objects, things like that. The information created a consistent pattern. Edward Harrison knew of the existence of buried evidence and had spent years trying to locate it. His desperate reaction when Arthur mentioned the discovery confirmed that he still feared the revelation of these secrets. Meanwhile, the pressure on Arthur and Margaret increased. They began receiving anonymous calls in the middle of the night, always with distorted voices saying things like, "Forget this story," or "Don't mess with people you shouldn't." Margaret was getting more and more nervous. During the day, when Arthur went out to talk to lawyers or witnesses, she locked herself in the house and only opened the door to people she knew. At night, any noise would startle her. "Arthur, is it worth going through all this?" she asked one night after another anonymous call. "Margaret, I can't give up now. My grandfather suffered his whole life because of this injustice. I won't let the Harrisons keep benefiting from a fraud. But what if something happens to us?" It was a legitimate concern, but Arthur felt he had crossed a point of no return. Discovering the truth about his grandfather had become more important than his own safety. The situation took an unexpected turn when Dr. Scott received a phone call from Edward Harrison, proposing a meeting to discuss a friendly agreement. "He wants to talk?" said Arthur, surprised. By the tone of his voice, he was very nervous. "I think the evidence we found scared him more than we expected." The meeting was scheduled for Dr. Scott's office, neutral ground where Edward couldn't use his influence to intimidate. Arthur and Margaret arrived early, anxious to find out what kind of proposal would be offered. When Edward Harrison entered the office, he seemed to have aged 10 years in the last few weeks. He was accompanied by 2 lawyers from Denver, men in expensive suits who exuded the kind of confidence only money can buy. "Well, let's get straight to the point," said one of the lawyers. "My client is willing to make a generous settlement to avoid a long and draining lawsuit for everyone." "What kind of settlement?" asked Dr. Scott. $500,000, paid immediately, in exchange for relinquishing any rights to the properties in question. The offer was substantial by Arthur and Margaret's standards, but paltry considering the real value of the properties. It was obviously an attempt to buy their silence for a fraction of what they were truly entitled to. "And if we refuse?" asked Arthur. The second lawyer answered with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Then my client will be forced to defend himself vigorously against what he considers an attempted extortion based on forged documents." The threat was clear. Accept the little we are offering or prepare for a legal war that could last decades. Arthur looked at Margaret, trying to read her thoughts. $500,000 would completely transform their lives, allowing for a comfortable old age without financial worries, but it would also mean allowing the injustice against his grandfather to remain forever. "We will need time to think," said Dr. Scott. "You have until tomorrow at noon," replied the first lawyer. "After that, the offer will be withdrawn and we will go on the full offensive." After the Harrisons and their lawyers left, Dr. Scott was direct. "Arthur, this proves your case is very strong. No one offers $500,000 if they aren't afraid of losing much more. But what if they actually manage to prove the documents are fake? With the evidence we have, especially the neighbors' testimonies, it would be practically impossible. They're bluffing." Margaret, who had remained silent throughout the meeting, finally spoke. "I think we should continue." Arthur looked at her, surprised. Margaret had always been the more cautious of the two, the one who preferred safety to adventure. "Are you sure?" "Arthur, all our lives we've been honest, worked hard, raised our children with dignity. We can't accept dirty money now." The decision was made. They would refuse the offer and face the consequences, whatever they might be. The next day, Dr. Scott communicated the refusal of the settlement. The reaction was immediate. That same day, Arthur and Margaret were notified of a criminal lawsuit for attempted extortion and document forgery. "It was expected," said Dr. Scott. "It's an intimidation tactic. With the evidence we have, this charge won't succeed. But the psychological effect was devastating. For the first time in their lives, Arthur and Margaret were defendants in a criminal case. Shame and fear mixed with indignation at the injustice. The situation got even worse when the story leaked to the local newspaper. The headline was sensationalist. Retired couple accuses prominent family of historical fraud. The article, clearly biased in favor of the Harrisons, portrayed Arthur and Margaret as opportunists trying to take advantage of a respected family's good faith. The evidence found was described as supposedly old and of questionable authenticity. "Arthur, I can't leave the house anymore," said Margaret after reading the newspaper. "Everyone in the neighborhood will think we're criminals." The social pressure was almost unbearable. At the bakery, the supermarket, the pharmacy, Arthur noticed suspicious looks and conversations that abruptly stopped when he approached. Some people avoided greeting him. Others made comments under their breath that clearly referred to the situation. But not everyone reacted negatively. Mrs. Dorothy, the neighbor who had witnessed the suspicious visits from Edward Harrison, made a point of visiting them to show her support. "You are decent people," she said, "and I know that Edward Harrison was up to something in your backyard. If you need me to speak to anyone else, you can count on me." Other longtime neighbors also showed discreet support. They had known Arthur and Margaret's character for decades, and that weighed more than newspaper headlines. The criminal case was a fiasco from the start. When the prosecutor analyzed the evidence presented by the Harrisons, he immediately realized the accusation was baseless. The documents found were clearly decades old, and the neighbors' testimonies confirmed that something had been buried a long time ago. In less than a month, the criminal charges were dismissed for lack of evidence. But the damage to their reputation was already done, and Edward Harrison knew that had been his true intention. "Now we can focus on the civil lawsuit," said Dr. Scott, "and with the dismissal of the criminal charges, our position has become even stronger. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. The expert analysis of the documents brought excellent news. 3 independent experts confirmed that the papers indeed dated back to the 1950s, that the inks and paper were consistent with the period, and that there were no signs of forgery or later alteration. More importantly, the handwriting analysis confirmed that all of Edward Miller's signatures on the documents were authentic, compared to other official documents from the time that were located in regional records offices. With these reports, it's impossible to question the authenticity of the documents, said Dr. Scott. Now it's just a matter of time. But Edward Harrison and his lawyers did not give up easily. They filed appeals, requested new expert analyses, questioned the competence of the experts, and used every stalling tactic available in the legal system. During this period, Arthur and Margaret's life was an emotional roller coaster. Some days brought encouraging news about the case's progress. Others brought setbacks and new obstacles created by the opposing defense. Margaret developed blood pressure problems due to the constant stress. Arthur, in turn, became obsessed with the case, spending hours reading legal documents and researching legal precedents online. "Arthur, you need to take care of your health," Margaret would say when she saw him studying papers late into the night. "What good is winning the case if you're not here to enjoy it?" But he couldn't stop. The quest for justice for his grandfather had become his reason for living, consuming all his thoughts and energy. The first significant victory came 6 months later, when the judge rejected all appeals filed by the Harrisons' defense and ruled that the case should be tried on its merits. It was a decision that meant the evidence would be analyzed objectively, without the procedural maneuvers that had been used to delay the trial. The main hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in September. Arthur spent the previous week unable to sleep properly, mentally rehearsing everything he wanted to say if he were called to testify. On the day of the trial, the courthouse was full. The story had gained regional attention, and several journalists were present to cover the case involving a traditional family and allegations of historical fraud. Edward Harrison arrived accompanied by his family and a team of 4 lawyers. He seemed confident, greeting acquaintances and calmly speaking with his legal representatives. Arthur and Margaret, on the other hand, were visibly nervous. Margaret held her husband's hand firmly, whispering words of encouragement as they awaited the start of the hearing. The judge, Judge Frederick Sterling, was known for his impartiality and for not being intimidated by the social standing of the parties involved. At 50 years old, he had a reputation for analyzing complex cases based purely on the evidence presented. The presentation of evidence lasted nearly 3 hours. Dr. Scott methodically showed all the documents found, the expert reports confirming their authenticity, the witness testimonies about the suspicious behavior of Edward Harrison, and the photographs that proved the original fraud. The Harrisons' lawyers presented a defense based mainly on technical arguments about statutes of limitations and the claim that, even if there were irregularities decades ago, they had been remedied by time and the good faith of the current owners. "Your Honor," said the Harrisons' lead attorney, "my client and his family have managed these properties in good faith for 70 years. They built businesses, created jobs, contributed to the city's development. It is not fair for them to be harmed by allegations about events that occurred before they were even born." It was an emotionally appealing argument, but legally weak. Good faith did not remedy an original fraud, especially when there was clear evidence that the Harrison family had always known about the irregularity. Dr. Scott's response was devastating. "Your Honor, good faith cannot be claimed when there is knowledge of the irregularity. And the evidence clearly shows that the defendant, Edward Harrison, always knew the properties did not rightfully belong to him. His desperate attempts to locate and destroy the evidence prove his awareness of the fraud." When the time came for personal testimonies, Arthur was called first. His hands trembled as he approached the microphone, but his voice came out firm and clear. "Your Honor, I am not here for money. I lived my whole life believing my grandfather had abandoned our family out of greed. Discovering he was the victim of a fraud changed everything for me. He deserves for the truth to be known and for justice to be done, even if it is 70 years later." Margaret was also called to testify. Her statement was brief but moving. "Your Honor, my husband is an honest man who has worked his whole life to support our family with dignity. If he says this evidence proves his grandfather was deceived, I believe him completely." Edward Harrison, when called to testify, chose to exercise his right to remain silent. His refusal to answer direct questions about knowledge of the original fraud was interpreted negatively by the judge. The most dramatic moment of the hearing came when Dr. Scott presented the restored music box. The mechanism had been repaired by a specialized watchmaker, and when the melody began to play in the silence of the courtroom, several people were visibly moved. "This music, Your Honor, played in the author's grandfather's house 70 years ago. It was buried along with the evidence of the fraud as a message of hope for future generations. Today, it is finally playing again at the moment justice will be restored." The session was closed with the judge announcing the verdict would be delivered in 15 days. The following 2 weeks were the longest of Arthur and Margaret's lives. On the day of the verdict, the courtroom was packed once more. Judge Frederick Sterling entered with a serious expression that gave no hint of his conclusions. After a detailed analysis of all evidence presented, he began, "This court has reached the unequivocal conclusion that the properties in question were obtained through document fraud by Alfred Harrison in the 1950s. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Edward Harrison grew visibly pale, while Arthur squeezed Margaret's hand tightly. "The evidence is clear and irrefutable. The documents found are authentic. The photographs prove the existence of bribery and corruption, and the subsequent behavior of the Harrison family demonstrates knowledge of the irregularity." The judge continued for another 20 minutes, detailing the legal foundations of his decision. When he reached the dispositive part, his voice rose slightly. "For these reasons, I rule in favor of the plaintiff, declaring the fraudulent deeds null and void, ordering the restitution of the properties to the rightful heirs, and sentencing the defendants to pay compensation for the profits wrongfully obtained during the period of illegal occupation." The verdict ordered the Harrison family to return all properties that originally belonged to Edward Miller, in addition to paying compensation of $42 million for profits obtained during 70 years of illegal exploitation. Arthur was in shock. For months, he had prepared for the possibility of defeat, but he had never truly believed they could win so categorically. Margaret cried discreetly, not from sadness but from relief. The fight was over, and they had won. On the other side of the courtroom, Edward Harrison was urgently conferring with his lawyers. It was obvious they would appeal, but a victory in the first instance was a huge step. Dr. Scott was beaming. "Arthur, this is one of the clearest and most well-founded verdicts I have ever seen. It will be very difficult for them to overturn this on appeal." In the following days, the story gained national attention. Newspapers across the country reported on the case of the retiree who discovered million-dollar fraud in his backyard and the secret buried for 70 years worth $42 million. The media coverage was mostly favorable to Arthur and Margaret. The story of the wronged grandfather and the grandson who fought to restore his honor touched the hearts of thousands of people. But the legal battle was not over yet. As expected, the Harrison family filed an appeal, alleging procedural flaws and errors in legal interpretation. The case would be analyzed by the Court of Appeals, a process that could take another 1 or 2 years. During this waiting period, Arthur and Margaret's life changed radically. Even without having received the compensation yet, they were treated completely differently in town. Shopkeepers offered discounts, distant acquaintances began greeting them warmly again, and even some people who had been hostile during the trial now showed respect. "It's amazing how money changes the way people see us," Margaret commented. "It's not the money, Margaret, it's justice. People respect those who fight for what is right." They received dozens of letters of support from people all over the country who had read about the case. Many told similar stories of family injustices that could never be repaired. One letter in particular moved them deeply. It was from a 90-year-old lady who lived in another state. "Dear Arthur and Margaret, my grandfather was also deceived by a dishonest partner in the 1940s. Our family lost an entire farm and could never prove the fraud. When I read about your victory, I cried with joy. Congratulations for never giving up on the truth." After 18 months of review, the Court of Justice fully upheld the first instance ruling. The appellate judges were even harsher in their moral condemnation of the Harrison family, describing the case as a shocking example of how corruption and impunity can perpetuate injustices for decades. The decision was unanimous, making any further appeal practically impossible. Edward Harrison, defeated and financially ruined, was forced to negotiate a settlement for the payment of damages. He did not have enough liquid assets to pay the $42 million all at once, so a payment schedule was established that included the sale of several properties. The first payment arrived in Arthur and Margaret's account on a Wednesday morning. It was $5 million, more money than they had ever seen in their entire lives. "Arthur, I don't even know how to spend all this," said Margaret, looking at the bank statement. "Neither do I, but I know how not to spend it." They decided that the first thing to do would be to buy a larger and more comfortable house, but without extravagance. They wanted to maintain the simplicity that had always characterized their lives. The second decision was to establish an educational fund for underprivileged youth in the region, especially those interested in studying law. It was a way to give back to the community and honor the memory of the lawyer who had helped them achieve justice. "Let's call it the Edward Miller Legacy Fund," suggested Arthur. "It's a way to ensure my grandfather's name is remembered for something good." Margaret immediately approved the idea. Throughout the struggle, they had received so much support from the community that they felt a moral obligation to give back. The third decision was to travel. At 70 years old, they had never left Colorado. Now they had the resources and health to see the country and the world. "Where do you want to go first?" asked Arthur. "To Washington, where your grandfather went back then. I want to see the places he visited." The trip to Washington was emotional and revealing. They managed to locate old records in the state archives that confirmed the version of events presented in Joaquim Pereira's letter. He had indeed traveled to resolve legal matters related to a family inheritance and planned to return within a few months. They also found descendants of other people mentioned in the grandfather's letters, who confirmed details of the story and praised Joaquim Pereira's integrity. "Your grandfather was known as a very honest man," recounted an elderly lady who was the daughter of a lawyer who had tried to help Joaquim decades earlier. "My father always regretted not being able to help him recover his land." I'm glad justice was finally served. Back in Aspen, Arthur and Margaret dedicated themselves to managing their new reality. The damage payments arrived regularly, and they consulted with financial experts to ensure the money was well managed. They bought the new house, modest but comfortable, and furnished it with simple but quality furniture. Joaquim Pereira's music box was given a place of honor in the main room, playing its nostalgic melody whenever they had visitors. The Edward Miller Legacy Fund was formalized with an initial capital of $10 million. The goal was to offer full scholarships to low-income youth who wanted to study law, with preference for those interested in human rights and social justice. "It's important that there are lawyers willing to fight for the underdog," explained Arthur during the fund's launch ceremony. "My grandfather didn't have that chance in his time, but perhaps we can help others have it." The story took on an even greater dimension when it was adapted into a documentary that premiered on national television. The program showed not only the specific case of Arthur's family, but also discussed broader issues of justice, historical corruption, and the importance of never giving up on the truth. Edward Harrison, completely defeated and publicly humiliated, sold his last properties in Aspen and moved to another state. Before leaving, surprisingly, he sent a letter to Arthur. "Mr. Arthur, I acknowledge that my father made a grave mistake 70 years ago and that my family perpetuated this injustice. I ask for forgiveness on behalf of past and present generations. You fought with dignity for something you believed in, and you deserve the respect of all of us." The letter was an unexpected gesture of humility that deeply touched Arthur. It showed that even in situations of extreme conflict, it was possible to maintain humanity and mutual respect. 2 years after the discovery of the music box, Arthur and Margaret had become respected figures not only in Aspen, but throughout the region. They were often invited to give talks on perseverance, justice, and the importance of never giving up on one's values. "You have become symbols that it is possible to overcome injustice," said the city's mayor during an official tribute. "You have shown that ordinary people with courage and determination can stand up to the powerful and win." Margaret, who had always been a reserved person, learned to speak publicly about the experience they had lived through. Her talks were especially moving because they conveyed the perspective of a wife who had unconditionally supported her husband, even in the most difficult moments. "I was often afraid," she admitted during her presentations, "but I knew it was the right thing to do. Sometimes in life, we need to be brave not because we are not afraid, but in spite of it." The most rewarding aspect of the whole experience was the impact they had on other people facing similar injustices. They regularly received letters and emails from people asking for advice on how to fight corruption, fraud, or abuses of power. Whenever possible, they recommended honest lawyers and offered moral support, and sometimes even financial aid for meritorious cases. The Edward Miller Legacy Fund expanded its activities to include not only scholarships, but also free legal counsel for low-income families. One Sunday afternoon, 3 years after finding the music box, Arthur was in the backyard of their new house, planting rose bushes for Margaret. Working with the earth always calmed him and made him think. Margaret approached with 2 cups of coffee, a ritual they had maintained for decades. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, sitting on the bench they had placed under the replanted cherry tree. "I'm thinking about my grandfather. How different it would have been if he had been able to fight in his time." "Perhaps it wasn't the right time. Perhaps it needed to wait for you." Margaret's reflection made sense. In the 1950s, Edward Miller had faced a society where corruption was even more accepted and where ordinary people had few resources to confront the powerful. 70 years later, although problems persisted, there was more transparency, more access to justice, and more awareness of rights. "You know what makes me proudest in this whole story?" said Arthur. "What?" "That we managed to prove my grandfather was an honest man. For our entire lives, our family carried the shame of thinking he had abandoned us for money. Now we know he was a victim, not a villain." The rehabilitation of Edward Miller's memory had been from the beginning more important to Arthur than any financial compensation. The money was welcome and useful, but the restoration of family honor was priceless. They decided to erect a small monument in memory of Edward Miller in the main square of Aspen. The simple but dignified statue bore an inscription that summarized his story. Edward Miller, 1895-1960, a man of integrity who fought for truth and justice. The unveiling of the monument was an emotional event that brought together hundreds of people. Distant relatives who had lost contact over the decades appeared to pay their respects. Many shared stories about Edward that confirmed his upright character and his reputation as a trustworthy person. "My father always said that Uncle Edward was the most honest man he knew," recounted a distant cousin who came from another state. "When he disappeared, the whole family was left confused. Now it all makes sense." During the event, Arthur gave a speech that moved everyone present. "My grandfather planted a seed of justice that took 70 years to germinate, but when it finally sprouted, it bore fruit that will nourish many generations. May his story inspire others to never give up on the truth, no matter how long it takes to come to light." The case of Arthur and Margaret inspired changes in local legislation regarding statutes of limitations in cases of document fraud. Several municipalities in the region passed laws facilitating the investigation of historical irregularities in property records, creating what became known as the Miller Justice Act. The original music box, carefully restored, was donated to the Historical Museum of Aspen, where it became one of the most visited pieces. An explanatory plaque tells the whole story, inspiring visitors about the importance of persistence in the pursuit of justice. But perhaps the most important legacy was the personal example that Arthur and Margaret left. They showed that ordinary people, without political or economic power, can confront long-standing injustices and win through perseverance, honesty, and moral courage. Margaret, now 72 years old, developed an unexpected hobby: writing. She began by recording the family history, but soon expanded to tell other stories of injustices she knew in the region. Her simple but moving texts were compiled into a book that became a regional bestseller. "I never thought I'd write anything in my life," she said during the book launch, "but I discovered that we all have important stories to tell." Arthur, in turn, became an activist for the rights of the elderly and retirees. He participated in conferences on active aging and used his story to show that age should not be an obstacle to fighting for what one believes in. "I was 68 years old when I found that box," he would say during his talks. "Many people thought I should let it go, that it was too late to stir up these things. But justice has no age. If you believe something is wrong, fight for it, no matter how old you are." The story gained international dimension when it was translated into other languages and published in human rights magazines. International organizations began using the case as an example of how judicial systems can, even belatedly, correct historical injustices. 5 years after the initial discovery, Arthur and Margaret received a special invitation to participate in a United Nations conference on transitional justice and historical reparation. It was the first time they would travel abroad. "I never imagined our story would go this far," said Margaret as they packed their bags. "I think stories of justice touch people's hearts anywhere in the world," Arthur replied. The presentation at the UN was a success. They told their story to an international audience of diplomats, legal experts, and human rights activists. What most impressed the audience was the simplicity and authenticity with which they narrated the events. "You remind us that justice is not just a technical or legal matter," said a European delegate after the presentation. "It is a profoundly human issue about dignity, truth, and reparation." Back in the US, they were received as local heroes. The mayor of Aspen declared the day of their return as Municipal Day of Justice and Truth, establishing an annual date for reflection on the importance of integrity and perseverance. The Edward Miller Legacy Fund had become one of the region's leading legal aid organizations, helping hundreds of families per year. The first scholarship recipients had already graduated from law school and begun their careers, some specializing in social justice cases, similar to the one that inspired the fund's creation. "It's moving to see young lawyers using the knowledge they gained to help others," said Arthur during a scholarship graduation ceremony. "It's as if my grandfather were continuing his fight through them." One of the scholarship recipients, Jennifer Taylor, the daughter of a humble family from the rural area, specialized in land rights and had already helped resolve several land disputes involving small farmers. "If it weren't for the Edward Miller Legacy Fund scholarship, I could never have studied law," she said. Now I can give back by helping other families going through situations similar to yours, Arthur. The properties recovered from the Harrison family were partly transformed into a community center offering free services for the low-income population, a medical clinic, daycare, library, and job training center. These lands were a source of suffering for 70 years, explained Margaret during the center's inauguration. Now we want them to be a source of joy and opportunity for our community. The center was named the Edward Miller Community Center and became a model copied by other towns in the region. The idea of transforming properties recovered through legal proceedings into community spaces gained traction as a more social alternative than a purely commercial one. Arthur and Margaret's health remained good, allowing them to stay active in their projects. At 75, Arthur still personally oversaw several of the fund's initiatives, while Margaret, at 74, published her second book of local stories. "The money hasn't changed who you are," observed Dr. Scott, who remained the couple's lawyer and close friend. "You're still the same simple, generous people I met years ago." "The money only amplified what we already were," replied Margaret. "If you are greedy, you become greedier. If you are generous, you become more generous." The couple's simple but profound philosophy about wealth and social responsibility inspired several wealthy people in the region to become more involved in philanthropic activities. The concrete example of how to use resources to benefit the community had a more lasting impact than any advertising campaign. One special afternoon, exactly 7 years after finding the music box in the snow, Arthur and Margaret received an unexpected visit. It was a young man about 30 years old who introduced himself as the great-grandson of Alfred Harrison. "My name is Simon Harrison," he said, visibly nervous. "I know our family caused your family a great deal of suffering, and I've come to apologize personally." Simon explained that he had grown up hearing conflicting stories about the origin of the family's wealth. When the case came to light, he decided to investigate on his own and discovered documents that completely confirmed the version presented by Arthur. "My great-grandfather really did a terrible thing," he admitted, "and my family perpetuated this injustice for decades. I want you to know that not all the Harrisons agreed with what was done." Simon's visit was a moment of definitive healing for Arthur and Margaret. It represented the acknowledgement by the very family responsible for the original injustice that they had been victims and not villains. "Simon, we hold no grudge," said Margaret. "You are not responsible for the mistakes of past generations. What matters is that everyone now knows the truth." Simon had become a lawyer specializing in human rights, ironically inspired by his own family's history. He offered his services free of charge to the Edward Miller Legacy Fund, wanting to contribute to repairing in some way the damage caused by his ancestors. "It would be an honor to work for you," he said. "Perhaps it's a way for my family to finally do the right thing." The reconciliation with a member of the Harrison family was widely reported and seen as an example of how historical conflicts can be resolved through the acknowledgement of truth and genuine forgiveness. The music box in the museum became a must-see for tourists visiting Aspen, but more than a historical curiosity, it represented hope for people facing their own injustices. "How many people have told me that, after learning our story, they decided not to give up fighting for something they believed in," commented Arthur during a visit to the museum. Margaret's book on local stories included not only the case of the music box, but also dozens of other stories of ordinary people who had faced adversity with courage and dignity. The book became study material in schools across the region, inspiring young people about values like perseverance and integrity. One of the stories that most touched readers was about a lady who had fought for 40 years to prove her husband's innocence, falsely accused of a robbery he did not commit. Inspired by the example of Arthur and Margaret, she resumed her fight and finally succeeded in getting the case reviewed. "Your story gave me the strength to continue," the lady told Margaret. "If you succeeded after 70 years, I can succeed after 40. The multiplying impact of the story was creating a network of people determined not to accept injustices passively. It was as if the courage of Arthur and Margaret was spreading, inspiring others to fight for their own causes. During an interview for national television, Arthur was asked what the main lesson was that he wanted people to take from his experience. "The main lesson is that the truth always finds a way," he answered. "It may take decades, it may be difficult, it may seem impossible. But if you persist and never give up on your values, the truth always comes to light." Margaret added, "And another important thing, you don't need to be rich or powerful to fight for justice. Sometimes the simplest people are the ones who make the most profound changes." The interview was seen by millions of people and generated hundreds of letters from viewers sharing their own stories of fighting against injustices. Many asked for advice on how to proceed with their specific cases. The couple decided to create a website where they could respond to these requests in an organized way. The Justice and Truth portal became a meeting point for people facing similar situations, offering basic legal guidance and, most importantly, emotional support. "Sometimes what people need most is to know they are not alone," said Margaret, "that someone believes their story and supports them." The site included a section where volunteer lawyers offered free guidance for meritorious cases. Several of the Edward Miller Legacy Fund scholarship recipients now graduated were actively participating in this initiative. The story of Arthur and Margaret also inspired a broader cultural shift in Aspen. The city, previously known mainly for its cold climate and rural tourism, came to be recognized as an example of how communities can support the pursuit of social justice. The mayor created an annual award called the Edward Miller Civic Courage Award to honor people who stood out in fights for rights or social justice. The first award was given to a teacher who reported corruption in the school lunch program, despite pressures to remain silent. "Arthur and Margaret changed the spirit of our city," said the mayor during the ceremony. "They showed that Aspen does not accept injustices passively." 8 years after the discovery of the music box, Arthur was diagnosed with a heart condition that, while not serious, required changes to his routine. At 76, he needed to reduce his physical activities and delegate more responsibilities in the fund. "I can't do everything I used to do before," he admitted to Margaret, "but I think we've planted enough seeds for other people to continue the work." Margaret, always pragmatic, helped him organize a gradual transition of responsibilities. Simon Harrison, Alfred's great-grandson who had joined the fund, took on many of the administrative functions, while the first scholarship graduates began coordinating the legal aid programs. "The most important part is already done," said Margaret. "We proved that truth can overcome injustice. Now it's others' responsibility to continue this fight." During a routine medical checkup, Arthur spoke with his cardiologist about the effects of prolonged stress he had faced during the years of legal battle. "Doctor, it was worth it," he said. "I'd rather have lived intensely fighting for justice than to have had a quiet life knowing my grandfather had been unjustly slandered." The doctor, who knew the story, commented, "Mr. Arthur, I've treated many wealthy people, but few show the peace of mind you have. The money you won wasn't the most important thing, was it?" "The money was a consequence," replied Arthur. "The most important thing was discovering that my grandfather was a man of integrity, and that our family always had reason to be proud of him." The physical limitations allowed Arthur to dedicate himself more to writing. He began working on his memoirs, not just about the music box case, but about his entire life as a mason, father, and husband. "I want my grandchildren to know not only the story of the lawsuit, but what life was like before all this happened," he explained to Margaret. "I want them to understand that we were happy people even though we were poor." Arthur's memoirs revealed a broader perspective on values and happiness that deeply touched his readers. He wrote about the satisfaction of building houses with his own hands, about the simple joy of family dinner after a day of honest work, about the importance of keeping one's word. "Wealth didn't change me because I was already rich in things money can't buy," he wrote. "I had a wife who loved me, children who respected me, neighbors who trusted me. The lawsuit only proved that these values were stronger than we thought." Margaret also began her third book, focused specifically on the wives and partners of people involved in fights for justice. She had received many letters from women asking for advice on how to support husbands or children facing similar legal battles. "Being the wife of someone fighting for justice isn't easy," she wrote. "You share all the worries, all the fears, but you rarely receive recognition. At the same time, you have the opportunity to be part of something bigger than yourselves. Margaret's book included interviews with dozens of women who had supported family members in similar struggles. It was a moving portrait of quiet courage and unconditional support in times of adversity. During a Sunday afternoon, 9 years after finding the music box, Arthur and Margaret were in their garden watching their grandchildren play. The family had grown with new marriages and births, bringing additional joy to their lives. "Grandpa, tell the story of the buried box again," asked Julia, the youngest granddaughter, only 6 years old. Arthur smiled. It was the 100th time he had told the story to his grandchildren, but he never grew tired of it. Each time he told it, he remembered different details and perceived new meanings in the experience they had lived. "It was a very cold winter morning, and there was a lot of snow in the backyard," he began, and the children gathered close, already knowing the story but always eager to hear it again. Margaret watched the scene with tenderness. Seeing her husband pass on values of honesty and perseverance to the new generations was one of the greatest joys of her life. "And the moral of the story?" asked Peter, the 8-year-old grandson, anticipating the question his grandfather always asked at the end. "The moral is that truth is like a seed," replied Arthur, as always. "It can stay buried for a long time, but when it finally sprouts, it produces fruit that feeds many people for many years." The family tradition of telling the story had become an important ritual for passing on values. The grandchildren grew up knowing they came from a family that valued honesty above convenience, justice above ease. The Edward Miller Legacy Fund had expanded to other states, always maintaining its focus on legal assistance for low-income people and human rights education. More than 500 young people had already received scholarships, and many were making a difference in their communities. "Sometimes I get letters from lawyers who were our scholarship recipients, telling me about cases they won for poor families," said Arthur during a fund board meeting. "It's as if my grandfather were continuing the fight through them." One of the stories that made him most proud was that of Carla Mendez, a former scholarship recipient who had specialized in elderly rights. She had managed to recover a pension that had been unjustly denied to an 80-year-old woman, allowing her to have a dignified old age. "It was thinking about your grandfather's story that I didn't give up on the case," Carla wrote to Arthur. "If he didn't give up after 70 years, I couldn't give up after 2. The impact of the scholarships went beyond the direct beneficiaries. Many recipients created their own social projects, multiplying the reach of the initiatives. It was a cascade effect of generosity and social commitment that exceeded all original expectations. During the 10th anniversary of the discovery of the music box, Aspen organized a special week of events celebrating the Decade of Justice. There were lectures, exhibitions, plays, and even a special documentary produced by the local television station. 10 years ago, we were just a curious retiree and his worried wife," said Arthur during the opening ceremony. "Today, our story has touched thousands of lives and inspired hundreds of other fights for justice." Margaret, now 84 but still lucid and active, added, "The most important discovery we made was not the music box. It was discovering that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they fight for the truth." The event attracted visitors from across the country, including many people who had been inspired by the story to fight for their own causes. It was an emotional gathering of people who shared similar values about justice and perseverance. One of the most touching moments was when Simon Harrison, now the general coordinator of the fund, gave a speech about reconciliation and historical reparation. "My great-grandfather's family caused 70 years of injustice, but the last 10 years have taught me that it's never too late to do the right thing. Working for the fund, I feel I am finally honoring my family's name the right way." The original music box was temporarily removed from the museum to play during the ceremony. When its melody echoed through the packed auditorium, many people were visibly moved. It was as if the music carried with it all the hopes and sufferings of the previous decades, finally transformed into something beautiful and inspiring. Arthur, at 81 years old, still kept a clear mind despite increasing physical limitations. During an interview for a national newspaper, he was asked about his plans for the future. "My plans are simple," he replied. I want to keep seeing the fun grow and help more people. I want to see my grandchildren become adults of integrity. And I want people to remember, when I'm gone, that I lived defending the truth. And what about the material wealth you've acquired? Material possessions are tools. The important thing is to use those tools to build something that lasts longer than our own lives. Arthur's simple yet profound wisdom continued to inspire people of all ages. His interviews were often quoted in speeches about ethics and social responsibility. Margaret began dedicating more time to gardening, a passion she had developed in the new house. Her garden became famous in the city, not just for its beauty, but because she offered free seedlings to anyone interested. Planting is an act of faith, she would say while working among the flowers. You plant today believing it will bloom tomorrow. It's the same with justice. Margaret's garden became a tourist attraction, with visitors coming not only to see the flowers, but to talk with the woman who had supported one of the country's most famous fights for justice. One afternoon, while watering the plants, Margaret was visited by a young journalist who was writing a book about women who supported their husbands in important struggles. "Mrs. Margaret, did you ever think about giving up during the hardest moments?" "I did," she admitted. "There were nights I cried from fear when I wanted to ask Arthur to stop everything. But in the morning, when I woke up and saw his determination, I knew we were on the right side of history." What kept you strong? The certainty that we were fighting for the truth, and truth has a strength that sustains people even in the most difficult times. Margaret's words were included in the journalist's book and later quoted in various lectures about family support in times of crisis. Her perspective on quiet strength and unconditional support resonated especially with women facing similar situations. End of story. Now we want to know your opinion. What did you think of Arthur's determination to seek the truth about his grandfather? Would you do the same in a similar situation? Leave your comment telling us if you know any story of injustice that was repaired over time. And most importantly, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving stories like this one.